Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting a garden pond. I remember not liking a stream painting that I painted a while back. I know I personally find it really hard to simplify such full compositions and not overwork the layers, so I took it upon myself to use this opportunity as practice. I began by masking the sides, and while I'm at it, let me just show you the reference image that I used. This has similar characteristics as to how much is going on in the composition with similar colors all throughout, and it's certainly a challenge for me to simplify and approach this painting. This is actually my second attempt to paint this, as I fell into the same trap of overworking the first painting. Let me just show you the first attempt. As you can see, it lacks depth, and I tried to counter the lack of depth by adding more colors and flowers. I didn't feel like it did much, but overcomplicate the composition further, and it also didn't help with the depth either. I feel like I did a better job with the second attempt, though I still need to do many more of these types of paintings to further practice. But let me just get back to the painting. I'm sketching out the stone formations in order to divide up the spacing for the top part and the bottom part of the pond. I want to make sure that the separate stones piled together is also fairly clear for me to divide the light and dark areas as I paint later. The lines that I'm making is very loose here, just like my usual sketches, so I can make sure to shift things around easily without wasting too much time. Another thing that I'm mindful of will be the angle of certain stones, especially when the water will be flowing down in certain areas, and this has to make sense for the whole painting. For the stones at the top, we're able to see more of the sides, and they're overall a bit flatter compared to the ones in front due to the perspective, so I'm keeping this in mind as I sketch. Once I'm done drawing out the stone formations, I'm going to erase certain areas for vegetation and also mask the highlighted areas for some of the plants, the flowing water, and also shapes for the colorful flowers. As I'm masking the area where the water will be flowing down the stones here, this is where the angle will come into play, so I do want to make sure that the direction of the water is flowing towards the main area of the pond. For the flowers further away, I more or less turn the shapes into like a blob, but for larger ones, if it is possible, I like to draw out the shapes of those flowers with the masking fluid. After I've masked off the areas that I want, I'm going to add more stones underneath the area where the small waterfall is. And doing this after I've masked the area will just help me visualize what's under the water and what's above the water. Next, here are the colors that I'll be using. This is Quin Sienna by Daniel Smith, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Sepia by Holbein, Prussian Blue by Holbein, New Gamboge by Daniel Smith, Sap Green by Holbein, Quin Red by Daniel Smith, and Rose of Ultramarine by Daniel Smith. I'm also going to use Bleed-Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. Since the masking fluid is still a little bit wet, I'm going to avoid painting on those areas, so I'm going to paint the main pond first. I started by wetting or dampening the surface, then on my palette I'm going to mix up some sap green with cobalt blue. On the side I'm going to add some New Gamboge as well as Quin Sienna. So what I'm doing here is to play around with the different ratios of the mixtures and placing it on while the surface is still damp around the sides, and I slowly pull the colors inwards, so the color at the center is a little bit lighter than what it is on the outer portion of the pond. I'm also going to paint on the stones. So here I have a mix of yellow ochre with Quin Sienna. I'm just mixing it using a medium to thin consistency, and while the surface is still wet, I like to play around with the different consistencies as well as the ratios, so the stones have different color variations. I'm also going to do the same for the stones at the bottom. To add some darker values, you can also add a little bit of sepia into the Quin Sienna, and again I'm going to place them randomly so the colors just mingle with each other. I like to look at the reference image and see what sort of tones of browns each section of the rocks have. So for this triangular area here, I felt like it's a little bit more muted and dark, so I added more sepia. And while the surface is still wet, you can also add other hues as well, like this rose of ultramarine, to bring more interest to the painting. For the round stones, I used a mix of rose of ultramarine with Quin Sienna and a bit of sepia in a light consistency. Then while the surface is still a touch damp, I would add a bit more sepia at the bottom for added shadows. I'm just going to wait for that to dry and move on to other areas to paint. Here I added a bit of Quin Sienna into the water because I felt like it needs a little bit of warmth since the water is quite shallow. Then I'm just going to keep filling in the base color of those stones in different tones of brown. Again, I'm looking at the reference image for some inspiration of those colors. I'm only going to paint on the lighter side of the stones and not worry about the shadows for now. If the area is not directly hit by the sun and is slightly darker in value, instead of painting on the shadows, I'm going to use a thicker consistency of the hue for now, just like this area here. Once I'm done covering the base color of the bottom part of the pond, I'm going to move on to the top. I'm starting by painting on the vegetation with a light yellow-green from a mix of Sap Green with new Gamboge. Then at the bottom, I'm going to use a slightly darker green by adding some Prussian blue into the previous mixture. I want the top section to be darker than the bottom in terms of value, so I'm going to use a slightly thicker consistency to paint the water. Here I'm switching between some browns and sap green with some of the yellows, which I'm going to place in the water to reflect on the flowers that I'm going to paint later on. For the darker greens, I use a mix of Prussian blue with sap green, and for the browns of the water, I used a mix of sap green with a bit of sepia. The rocks on the right is quite dark in value from the reference image, but it's also very yellow, so here I'm using the brown mix that I already had on my palette with added yellow ochre, and I'm using a medium to thick consistency to paint the base color. I'm also going to do the same for the stone formation on the left-hand side. Next, I'm going to paint the greeneries. For the greeneries on the left-hand side, I felt like the color is a little bit more of a cooler temperature, so I used a mix of Prussian blue with sap green in a thin consistency to paint the first layer. Then I use a darker mix of the same color with added sepia for the area in shadow on the left-hand side. After that, I'm going to paint the background. For this, I'm going to start by wetting the whole surface. I want this area to be very blurry, so I do want the surface to be evenly damp. Then I used the bluish green from a mix of Prussian blue and sap green, as well as the yellow green from sap green and new Gamboge, and scatter them all around. For some areas, I like to use a lighter color, and others I like to use the darker tone of green, so this is in a thicker consistency with added Prussian blue and sepia in the mix. And for areas right behind the light colored plants that I've already painted earlier, I try to paint in between so I don't contaminate the lighter color when I try to paint the details later on. Once I've covered the base color of the whole composition, I'm going to start layering on a bit more detail. So here I'm going to increase the vibrancy of certain areas, especially around the back, since I definitely want this area to be darker than the foreground. I'm basically using similar colors as the base, but just in a slightly thicker consistency to add a bit more detail. Like on this plant here, I added more lines to redefine some of those shapes. I'm also going to add a darker value on this plant here, so there's a little bit more depth to support the lighter areas that I painted as the base color. I'm also going to start painting on the details for the side of the stones. For this, I used the thick consistency of sepia, and for you to get an even darker color, you can also add a bit of Prussian blue for more of a muted dark tone, or a bit of Quin Sienna for a reddish brown. To create the form of the stones, I'm basically drawing out the outline of how they were placed, leaving out the top facing part of those flat stones. As for the bottom, I made the lines a little bit thicker in terms of weight, so the darker brown serves as the side which are in shadow. For the top face of those stones, I do want to increase the vibrancy and the value by using a thicker consistency of the base color, and this contrast between the background and the foreground will help create depth of the overall composition. I'm going to add similar rock formations for the areas under the water. As for the color, I used a mix of sap green, Prussian blue, and sepia to get a really deep greenish brown. For the shadows on the plants at the bottom, I used the same mixture but with added sap green and Prussian blue just to change the hue slightly. Here I'm also going to add more plants at the back once the background is completely dry, and here I'm using a thick consistency of the darker greens. I feel like I've built the dark values quite well at the back, so I'm going to move on to painting the foreground. For this, I cleaned out a section of my palette so I can mix fresh colors for the stones. For the darker values though, I'm going to use the palette at the bottom. I'm still using the same method, so if I want the rock formation to be a little bit more yellow, I would add more yellow ochre in the mixture. If it's a bit more red, I would add more Quin Sienna in the mixture. For it to be darker, I would add sepia, and you can also add other hues like the yellows, greens, blue, and rose of ultramarine, which has a bit of a purple tone. This is something that you can play around with, but aren't like the area at the back. This time I'm using a lighter consistency, so I can build and layer on the darker values a little bit slower than what I did with the area at the back. This way I can separate the foreground for it to be lighter, and this is what helps create the depth of the overall composition, and it's one of the mistakes that I made in my first attempt, where I mostly used more or less the same consistency all throughout the painting. Since I want the top face of those stones to stay nice and light, I'm going to slowly build on the darker areas or the areas in shadows, which are the size of these stones. I'm using mostly sepia as the darker tone, but just like the other parts of the stone, you can also add other hues into the sepia or add other browns to create different tones of those darker values. Since I was quite loose as I was painting the base color of all these stones, the main aim here is for me to define each of those stone formations, so it's a bit easier for me to build up the details later on. I feel like this area on the left here is generally darker, so I just glazed on more brown on top all the areas before separating the shapes by using sepia. Once I'm quite happy with the base value of this area, I'm going to leave them to dry, so the shadows that I'm going to paint on top to separate each of the stones will stay nice and crisp. I still felt like the area on the left is too light, so I'm going to glaze over the lighter areas using a mix of sepia and Quin Sienna for a slightly darker value and also more saturation. Where the water is flowing down, I'm going to paint on lines following the direction of where I masked the area using a slightly darker brown, but still in a thin consistency, so I can slowly build up the value instead. As I get closer to the foreground, I do want the colors to be lighter. So here, using the darker value of the browns, which has a lot of sepia in the ratio, I'm using more of a light consistency to separate those tones. Once I've separated the stones above the water, this is when I can start painting the ones below so I don't get confused along the way. For the stones under the water, I used a mix of sepia with a lot of Quin Sienna, but still in a light consistency, and I also like to add a little bit of sap green to make it blend with the color of the water. I also use a darker value to outline some of them to separate those stones, but I'm not really waiting for each area to dry completely. It's okay to add those outlines while the surface is still damp, so those darker values or the outlines are not as defined as the ones above water. Notice how I'm still trying to change up the hues. Some of the areas are a bit more yellow-green, some has more yellow ochre in the mix, and some has more Quin Sienna. As you can see, I'm still very careful with the consistency. I'm still painting very lightly because I want this area to stay in a lighter value compared to what I've painted at the back. I feel like I've covered enough of the features and they look quite defined for me to know what each of those areas are, so I'm going to take off the masking fluid. Once I've unmasked everything, I'm going to paint using the same color that I used for those objects in a thin consistency first to fill in those lighter areas. Then once I've added the lighter parts of those areas, I can start to build on the details to increase the depth of each object. So for the lighter value of this greenery, I used a mix of Prussian blue with sap green, and as for the darker areas, I used the same mix with added sepia in a thicker consistency. Next, for the flowers at the back, I used a mix of rose of ultramarine with a little bit of Prussian blue, starting with a light consistency, then going back in with a thicker consistency for the center while the surface is still a bit damp. For the next flower, I started by painting the stems and the leaves. As for the yellow, I used new Gamboge, and for the center, I added a little bit of Quin Sienna into the new Gamboge for a darker value. Moving on to the red plant on the right, I used a mix of Quin Sienna, Quin Red, and Sepia, and I just played around with the consistency for the darker values. As you can see, I keep on going back to this plant at the back because I felt like adding more density, so I'm adding more lines and details in between as I wait for each layer to dry. For the water, I'm going to start by using a thin consistency of sap green, and in between certain areas, I like to use a slightly thicker consistency of some of the browns to act as shadows under the water. Next, I'm going to paint more stones under the water. I'm basically just drawing outlines using different hues that I have on my palette in a light consistency. While I wait for that area to dry, I'm going to paint the flowers in the foreground. For this, I'm going to create a really light pink by using a really light consistency mix of Quin Red with a touch of yellow ochre. As for the center, I used a mix of sepia, Quin Red with a bit of Quin Sienna. Using the same color here in a really thin consistency, I'm just outlining certain parts of the flower for a bit more definition. Once I'm done, I'm going to move back and glaze on the water using a mix of sap green with a bit of Quin Sienna. And I'm also going to leave out the base color in certain areas and painting more of that green color, and the area that I'm leaving out will act as highlights or water reflections. Honestly, I found this part of the painting to be very difficult because there's so much going on in the reference image and I wasn't sure how to simplify it, but this is just the approach I've decided to take on. I decided to add these red leaves in the corner of the foreground just to add a bit of color. For this, I used a mix of Rose of Ultramarine with Quin Sienna, and I'm painting in a thick consistency. I basically started out by drawing an outline of the leaf shapes and then just filling in the rest of the color. Then using the same mix, I switched to my liner brush to paint the stems of those flowers. Since the red leaves are quite large, I'm going to add some details using a mix of bleed-proof white into the base color, and I'm going to paint on the midrib and the veins. After this, I'm going to use a medium consistency of bleed-proof white to add on the highlights on the water. I'm also going to paint on some dots and lines along the water edges. I feel like by adding those highlights along the edges, it creates the illusion of clear water and also shows the water level, since there wasn't enough definition before. I also decided to add more highlights to the water by adding some really light zigzag lines, but I tried to stop myself before I overworked this painting again. I feel like I've pretty much painted everything here. Lastly, I'm just going to add some extra textures to the stones by using the same colors with a dry brush. Once I'm done, I'm going to unmask the sides and reveal the painting. Then I'm going to have a look around and add some final adjustments, making sure I like the balance of the overall painting. After that, I'm basically done with this painting. I definitely need to practice much more in order to break down and simplify paintings. But if you guys enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. All the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!